All right, here is the promised lecture on Chapter 23. Apologies for being so slow about getting it out, but these are going to cover sections 1 and 2, the first one talking about sort of a new type of economy, which we hit on a little bit in class as well, and then the second one will talk about the politics of the day, which we completely neglected in class. So that's what we're looking at, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so right after the war, right after the First World War in 1920, we have a bit of a recession, but the U.S. economy recovers really quickly. By 1922, everything is running really smoothly, with the exception of the farming economy, which is really the only massively weak point in the U.S. economy in the 1920s. And a lot of the reason for this fast recovery is the introduction of a lot of new consumer goods. You have electrical products which are coming on the market, and various other things, all of these innovative new technologies which are feeding this sort of massive prosperity. The manufacture and marketing of these appliances, as well as the construction of things like hydroelectric plants, all provide a massive economic stimulus. The automobile, as we touched on a little bit of class, also helps fuel this economic boom. While it had been introduced before the war, much of America's automobile making capacity was going towards the war effort. Now the war is over, all those automobiles are being redirected to consumers, and they really take off in the 1920s, with Ford Motor Company leading the market until about the middle of the decade. By the end of the decade, though, the industry accounts for about 9% of all manufacturing wages, and also stimulated related industries like the rubber industry or the gasoline industry, or highway construction, and various other little things that are attached to driving and road travel. The stock market also reflecting this economic prosperity, and then actually outpacing the economic prosperity of the country. In order to supply overseas markets, you have big corporations like Ford and GM, but also other ones not related to the automobile industries, building production facilities abroad in other countries. However, true globalization would come much later. Economic nationalism was the prevailing attitude in the 1920s among most industrialized nations, and it was really concern for ourselves, almost at the expense of others. You see massively high tariff barriers in a lot of different countries and things like that, all reflecting this idea. Although prosperity lifts overall wages, workers tended to benefit a little unevenly. You have regional variations. Employers also practice discriminatory employment practices, and you also have, as I mentioned before, a massive problem in the farm prices. Grain prices are plummeting since the government no longer really needs to purchase huge amounts of grain, and so you have overproduction. New machinery increases production even further among farming, which just further depresses the prices, and so that's the one sector that's really actually hurting during this decade. All of this productivity, though, increased in the 1920s as you have new technology, new manufacturing technology. You have assembly line ideas, which are boosting efficiency as far as how much workers can produce. The assembly line also influenced the way that employers behaved towards their employees. Managers tended to discourage any kind of individual initiative, or even things like distracting conversation. In fact, Ford employees employed what became known as the sort of Ford whisper, where they would speak without moving their lips so that their managers didn't know that they were talking. All of this results in a diminishing of job satisfaction. Mass production in the U.S. also had influence or impact globally. You see the same kind of systems, assembly line systems, popping up in factories all over the world. Business consolidation also increased after the war. It was sort of encouraged by the war, and then increases afterwards as well. More than 1,000 companies a year vanished through mergers and things like that throughout the decade in the 1920s. And even companies that didn't formally merge formed trade associations, which pretty much standardized practices across various companies as well. We see a sort of maturing of United States capitalism, and with it you have a maturing of the way that the system is run, management procedures and things like that. The shift to a consumer economy also has a great effect on the way that we do business. You see wages rising voluntarily, essentially. Earlier periods, business owners wanted low wages because they wanted to be able to turn a profit and not have to pay their workers. But now that we are so intent on manufacturing and so intent on selling these goods, a lot of these leaders are realizing that in order to make that profit, people need to have money. And so it benefited them to increase wages so as to increase the sort of buying power of their workers. New systems for distributing goods also began to emerge. Automobiles managed to reach consumers through dealers. So you start to see those sorts of things popping up everywhere. Chain stores are now accounting for about 25% of retail sales. Department stores are being made more inviting. They're getting sort of a remodel. The introduction of air conditioning makes them very attractive places, especially in the summertime. You have credit sales, like we talked about before, where people could buy things on installment plans or take out loans for appliances and things like that. Advertisers also sort of win pride of place in marketing ideas. They use celebrity endorsements, promises of social success, threats of social embarrassment, all things that we saw in those ads that we looked at in class. They even kind of came to define what it meant essentially to be American. They claimed to be fulfilling the promises of the Declaration of Independence, and that if you buy these things, you are living up to the ideal of the pursuit of happiness. Business values also basically saturated the culture of the 1920s. President Harding and President Coolidge were both fervent admirers of corporate America, and magazines profiled business tycoons as the sort of celebrities. The number of working women as a proportion of the total female population was pretty steady in the 1920s at about 24%. But women who did enter the workplace found themselves facing quite a lot of discrimination, wage discrimination. Nearly 50,000 women also received college degrees in 1930, which was triple the 1920 figure. And so over the decade of the 20s, you see that becoming much more popular among women. And a lot of, however, those female students entered traditionally female occupations, such as nursing or librarianship or school teachers. You actually see a decline in the number of women's physicians and things like that, as medical schools tended to limit the number of women students who could get in. So this kind of marginalization was fairly common in the 1920s, and one could almost see it as a reaction against the sort of political gains that women make in the 1920s. But even though they were marginalized as workers, women were openly courted as consumers, as we saw in the advertisements. In this kind of dream world that's presented by advertisers, things like housework became an exciting challenge for women, as you can kind of get from the advertisement I've included on the slide, for an electric clothes washer, which basically essentially calls it the idea of washing clothes in it a second honeymoon almost, which is pretty absurd, I suppose. Organized labor also struggled in the 1920s. There were several factors that caused this as well. Overall, wages were rising, which gave workers less of an incentive to actually join the unions. And most of the unions' strength lay in traditional crafts and the older industries, but you have these new mass production industries which are not unionized at all. And so that, since that's where most people work, their membership is not as strong. Management was also openly hostile to organized labor, and that had a huge effect on it as well. As sort of anti-radical sentiments persisted, coming from the war and the sort of social impact of the war, opponents of labor unions quite often grouped them in with the sort of radical communist, socialist, anarchist type ideas, whether or not that label was accurate. The anti-union campaign also was obvious in subtler forms. Non-union shops were renamed as open shops, which sounds much more positive, and they dubbed it the American Plan of Labor Relations. Other corporations provided things like cafeterias or recreational facilities, and it was praised as welfare capitalism, this kind of anti-union strategy. It particularly hit women workers hard, and black workers as well. Large national labor unions like the American Federation of Labor officially prohibited things like racial discrimination, but local chapters tended to ignore those kinds of regulations. Corporations also tended to hire jobless black and immigrant workers as strike breakers, and so it geared up a lot of hostility towards those workers generally. And so working, while an improvement in the 1920s, is still somewhat miserable when it's compared overall. All right, so now we'll turn our attention to politics. When we look at the parties, white Southerners, urban immigrants at the beginning of the decade still tend to lean very heavily Democratic. The Republican Party is continuing to attract Northern farmers, business people, as well as a lot of white-collar workers and professionals, and even some skilled blue-collar workers. But by the end of the decade, we'll see a shift in some of those party loyalties. The GOP also benefited greatly from the sort of anti-radical mood that was fueled by things like the Red Scare, which we talked about at the end of Chapter 22. The Republican Party conservatives tended to control the convention in 1920 when it nominated Warren G. Harding as their presidential nominee. Warren G. Harding was a very congenial individual. And after the sort of stresses of the war and Wilson's sort of moralistic idealism, Americans liked the somewhat bland offering that came in the form of Harding. He, after winning the presidency, he made some notable cabinet selections, the good ones. Charles Evans Hughes was chosen as the Secretary of Agriculture. Andrew Mellon was chosen as the Treasury Secretary. Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce under him. But he also made some fairly disastrous appointments as well, which are going to sort of plague his presidency. Most notably, his Attorney General, a man called Darty, was a problem causer. Albert Fall was his Secretary of the Interior. Both of these two got involved in a rather large and disastrous scandal known as the Teapot Dome scandal, where they essentially took bribes from oilmen in order to transfer government-owned oil fields to these private companies in order for them to develop them. And once that came out, it it definitely set a shroud, I suppose, over Harding's presidency. These and other appointments all tended to be friends of his from Ohio, which is where he was from. They were very problematic throughout his presidency. However, in the summer of 1923, while he was on vacation, he suffered a heart attack in San Francisco and died. He was extremely popular at the time of his death, and he was very enthusiastically mourned by the population. But once all the scandals broke, it definitely sort of set a black cloud over Harding's memory. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, was insulated from these scandals. For the most part, vice presidents didn't have much of a job. They were just potential stand-ins for the president in case something happened to them. And so they didn't really get involved politically in the way that our modern vice presidents do. And so he was somewhat insulated from these scandals. He had a very notable image. He was known as Silent Cow. And it was a very well-crafted image. An advertising executive, actually, was the master of his sort of political image. It's the first, I suppose, really notable use of a PR man, one might say. In his job, this particular advertising executive planted pro-Coolidge articles in magazines and then used other marketing techniques to sell his candidate. He understood as well the political potential of radio and advised Coolidge to speak conversationally in his radio addresses, much the same way that we will hear Roosevelt do during his fireside chats. Franklin Roosevelt makes it really popular, but actually Coolidge was sort of the pioneer of that. Much like his Republican predecessor, Coolidge was extremely pro-business as far as the policies went. The 1920s pretty much characterized by pro-business policies. These included things like high tariffs, lowered income taxes for the upper tier income brackets. And the argument was made by the Secretary of the Treasury and by Mellon that it would actually increase revenues if we reduced the incentive for businesses and for wealthy individuals to seek tax shelters offshore. He encouraged business investment as well through this lower tax idea, saying that this would benefit everybody. And in the same kind of pro-business spirit, you see the Supreme Court taking action against various progressive reforms. Notably, they overturned the federal ban on child labor during this decade as well. While actively promoting these corporate interests, Coolidge also actively opposed any kind of government assistance for other Americans who weren't business related. This position faced its first real test in 1927 when you have massive amounts of rain causing severe flooding on and around the Mississippi River. The picture at the top is an image from this flood. And basically, Coolidge refused any kind of government assistance to the citizens that were hurting as a result of these floods. He rejected any calls to aid the victims, saying that the government had no duty to protect citizens against the hazards of the elements. He did, however, sign the Flood Control Act, which would construct levees in the hopes of preventing these kind of things from happening in the future. Another test of this ideology came when farmers rallied behind the McNary-Hagan bill, which was designed to essentially prop up farm prices. The government would buy the surplus of basic commodities like cotton, corn, rice, and so on, and then sell them back to essentially make a profit. Coolidge vetoed this bill twice when it came before him, warning of the tyranny of bureaucratic regulation and control, and arguing that the government shouldn't favor a single interest group, which is interesting because the government had been actively favoring corporations through high tariffs and other measures prior to this. So it's a bit of a contradiction. This leads a lot of angry farmers to switch their party loyalties in the midterm elections and then finally in the presidential election in 1928. And so you start to see farm votes going overwhelmingly Democrat at this point. Harding and Coolidge, in their administrations, also continued to oppose any kind of membership for the U.S. in international organizations. They still opposed the League of Nations and ultimately opposed entering into the World Court when it was created. The administrations pursued foreign politics that served America's economic interests, what historians have called independent internationalism. Despite the fact that post-war Europe was completely battered, Washington still demanded repayment of about $22 billion in debts and reparations, which ultimately was quite detrimental, as one could point directly to the inability to pay those things as a cause of the Second World War. They also worked to protect U.S. corporate interests in places like Latin America. There was one notable diplomatic achievement, though, and that was the Washington Naval Arms Conference, where it was agreed by the United States, Great Britain, Japan, and at least a couple of others to limit the sort of massive naval buildup that we see starting to happen in after the war, immediately after the war. There were specific ratios designed to limit the amount of warships that each naval power had. The treaty ultimately failed to prevent a second war as the Second World War comes along, but it did represent early efforts to control arms. Another treaty initiative, which is somewhat laughable in its broadness, was the result of which was the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which was essentially an agreement by several nations around the world not to go to war with each other, which is entirely useless as a treaty and more symbolic than anything, and ultimately, obviously, a huge failure as well. You do see as well some progressive resurgence in American politics. Reform spirit survived in Congress. You see the passage of the Shepard-Towner Act, which funded rural parental and baby care centers, as well as public health nurses to staff them. Federal Radio Commission was used to regulate the airways, which is a new necessity because radio is becoming so popular. In the midterm elections in 1922, you see farm groups and labor groups joining together to defeat a lot of Republican incumbents, conservative incumbents. And in 1924, the same alliance revived the Progressive Party and nominated Senator Robert La Follette for president. The convention, Democratic Convention in New York City, was split ultimately between urban and rural. Eventually managing to nominate a candidate, but the split is extremely symbolic of the conflict that I talked about in class on Tuesday between urban and rural, because it was those elements that were essentially splitting the Democratic Party. Coolidge very easily won the Republican nomination and very easily won the presidency as well, and a lot of that is probably reflected in just the prosperity of the nation. Usually when the nation is prosperous, political leanings tend to drift to the right, to the more conservative. The 1920s elections are particularly important as well because it's the first time we see women voters actively participating. The long struggle for suffrage culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, or rather the ratification of it in 1920. Suffrage advocates had long predicted that this reform would transform politics, and the hope survived, at least briefly after the war. You see the creation of a nonpartisan League of Women Voters designed to educate women voters about issues and various things that might interest them. But you don't really see women voting as a bloc, which very much limits their political effectiveness. Former suffragists scattered across the political spectrum, and so the movement loses a lot of focus. Even the League of Women Voters also gradually begins to abandon feminist activism. You have the more radical National Women's Party proposing a constitutional amendment for equal rights, the Equal Rights Amendment. But while it's popular, it loses steam really quickly. And some of the concerns were that it would actually nullify laws that protected women workers, which was something that women workers were obviously worried about. African American women generally more interested in battling racial discrimination than feminist issues. Hispanic women in the Southwest focusing more on labor issues than strictly feminist issues. And the general reactionary political climate also facilitates this retreat from feminism. So you kind of see a loss in the movement generally immediately following the 19th Amendment, where people just tend to lose interest in the whole idea of women's politics or politics directed specifically at women. Here I have a couple of cartoons designed to give you both sides of the suffrage argument. The cartoon on the left shows a somewhat allegorical female figure, and she's all caught up in sort of ropes and attempting to get out, and wrapped around her is a banner as well, which states politics is no place for women. And so definitely an anti-suffrage campaign. And you see these. You can find a lot of examples of these. There were several people, and some of them even women, who were against the idea of women's suffrage. And you get some very interesting imagery coming out of that as well. And on the right, the idea behind this picture is, I hope, fairly obvious. You have suffragettes at the top steamrolling over the opposition. Down at the bottom you can see spelled out in the sort of rocks, and the steamroller is labeled progress. And so the idea behind this is fairly obvious, that the vote for women can only mean good things. And while it was progress in some sense, in a way it was a bit of a step back. Early on, at least, most women voters just tended to vote with their husbands, so they were essentially just an extension of their husbands or their fathers or whoever's voice, and rather than speaking from their own voice or their own ideas or their own experiences. And so, in a way, it's kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of a situation for women voters. Yes, you have the right to vote, but at this point in time, they're not really utilizing it to further women's goals. And you don't really see a big shift as far as that goes until you get the second wave of feminism in the 1960s.